In 1990, Victor Alvarez pulled his yellow taxi away from a downtown stand in San Antonio, Texas. It was a Friday night, close to midnight, and he just radioed in that he was taking a fare across town. It was the last anyone ever heard from him. 20 minutes later, his dispatcher lost contact. By morning, his cab was gone. No accident, no wreckage, no body. Police searched for weeks. Docks, rivers, roadside ditches, nothing. His wife, Maria, was told he probably ran off, maybe chasing another life. Neighbors whispered about debts, even another woman. His son grew up believing the same thing, that his father had chosen to leave. For 22 years, that was the story the town accepted. Then in 2012, crews began draining Medina Lake for structural repairs. 30 feet down, tangled in silt and brush, divers found a 1988 Chevrolet Caprice taxi, perfectly preserved in the oxygen-starved water. Victor was still behind the wheel, his seatbelt fastened, his face changed by time, but still recognizable. At first, investigators thought it was an accident. The cab must have slipped off the road and into the reservoir. But the medical examiner noticed something that changed everything. A small caliber bullet hole at the base of Victor's skull, hidden under 2 decades of silt and water. He hadn't drowned. He'd been executed. Inside the taxi, just one thing had survived the dark water. A logbook, sealed in its plastic folder. On the final page, one entry stood out. The record of Victor's last fare. But the handwriting wasn't his. It belonged to someone else. Someone who had been in that taxi. Someone who waited 22 years for the truth to surface. Maria Alvarez was at the grocery store when the phone rang. It was late afternoon, a Tuesday, the kind of day where nothing unusual was supposed to happen. She had a small cart filled with tortillas, milk, and beans, the same staples she bought for decades. Her phone buzzed in the side pocket of her purse, an unfamiliar local number flashing on the screen. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, probably another telemarketer. But something made her answer. Hello? A man's voice, steady, professional. Mrs. Alvarez? This is Sheriff David Marino with Bexar County. I need you to find a quiet place to sit down. Maria frowned. She laughed, short and wrong. I'm at HEB. What is this about? A citation? No, ma'am, the sheriff said gently. It's about your husband, Victor. The grocery store light suddenly felt too bright, too loud. She gripped the car handle tighter. No, my husband's been gone for 22 years, her voice cracked. He left us. There was silence on the line. Then the sheriff said, We found him. The tortillas slipped from her cart and hit the linoleum. Maria's legs buckled. She sat heavily on a case of soda stacked in the aisle. For years, she had trained herself to say the words, he left us, without letting them sting. But now they returned with full force. That's not possible, she whispered. It is. Construction crews at Medina Lake drained part of the reservoir. Divers recovered a taxi cab at the bottom. A 1988 Chevrolet Caprice. The sheriff's voice was matter-of-fact, but softened at the edges. Your husband was inside. Maria pressed her free hand to her chest. Her pulse hammered. No, you don't understand. He left. He walked out. November 1990. He never came home. Ma'am, Sheriff Marino said. He didn't walk away. I'm going to need you and your son to come down to the medical examiner's office. Daniel Alvarez was 30 now, but when his mother called him, her words turned him back into an 8-year-old boy. They found your father, she said, voice shaking. Daniel had grown up with the story that his father had abandoned them. He'd hardened himself against it, repeating the line like a shield. My father drove a cab, and one day he drove away. He told girlfriends, teachers, coaches, anyone who asked. It was easier than explaining the shame. Now, standing outside his auto shop with grease on his hands, the words felt like an earthquake under his feet. What are you talking about? He demanded. They pulled his taxi from the lake. They said he was still inside. Daniel closed his eyes, leaned against the doorframe. Anger surged first. So now we're supposed to believe he crashed? After 22 years of thinking he just ran? Not a crash, his mother's voice broke. They said. They think it was something else. Daniel didn't answer. For 2 decades, he had carried the certainty that his father had chosen freedom over family. To have that ripped away in one phone call was unbearable. At the medical examiner's office that evening, Maria and Daniel sat side by side in the cold waiting area. Maria twisted a tissue into tight ropes in her hands. Daniel bounced his leg, jaw tight, eyes red. Sheriff Marino walked in, older than Maria remembered from years ago, his hair graying, uniform pressing against a middle-aged belly. But his eyes were kind and heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. Mrs. Alvarez, Mr. Alvarez, he began, taking a seat across from them. I know this is difficult, but the vehicle we recovered matches the van registered to Victor Alvarez's taxi. His wallet was still in his pocket. Dental records confirmed the identification. Maria shook her head. It can't be. He left us. Everyone said he. The sheriff interrupted gently. Ma'am, he didn't leave. Your husband was murdered. The words hung in the sterile air like poison. Daniel blinked. Murdered? Marino nodded slowly. The medical examiner found a bullet wound at the base of his skull. Small caliber. Likely a .22. He died before the cab entered the water. Maria covered her mouth. Daniel stood up, pacing. No, that doesn't make sense. For years you all said he ran. Insurance investigators, neighbors, everybody. I hated him for it. His voice cracked. Now you're telling me he was sitting at the bottom of a lake this whole time? I'm telling you the truth, the sheriff said. He pulled a folder from under his arm, set it on the table. The conditions at Medina Lake preserved more than we expected. Some of the cab's contents survived. One item in particular will change how we look at this case. Maria gripped the table. What item? But Marino didn't answer yet. Instead, he looked at both of them, making sure they were braced. I need you to see him first. They walked down a sterile hallway, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. Each step seemed heavier than the last. Daniel felt like a child again, walking behind his mother into a room where truth waited. The morgue door opened with a heavy clang. Inside, the cold air smelled of disinfectant and steel. A blue sheet covered a figure on the table. The medical examiner, a young woman with tired eyes, stood nearby. Family, she said softly, then pulled back the sheet to reveal Victor Alvarez's face. Maria gasped. Her knees nearly buckled. The man on the table was aged by 2 decades underwater, his skin leathery, his hair sparse but unmistakable. The strong jawline, the scar on his cheek from a teenage accident, the mustache he'd refused to shave. That's him, Maria whispered. Tears blurred her vision. That's my husband. Daniel pressed his fists against the metal table, staring. For so long he had told himself his father had walked away. Now here he was, silent proof of everything Daniel had tried not to believe. He didn't leave, Daniel said, voice hollow. He never left. The medical examiner met their eyes. Your husband's body shows a single gunshot wound. This wasn't an accident. Someone killed him and then drove the cab into the lake to cover it. Maria sobbed into her hands. Daniel turned away, fighting his own tears. Sheriff Marino stepped forward, opening the folder he carried. Inside was an evidence bag containing a water-stained but legible object. This was recovered from the cab, he said. It survived because it was sealed in a plastic taxi folder. It's your husband's logbook. He held it up, pages warped but intact. Daniel swallowed. And? Marino flipped to the final page. His last fare was written down. But the handwriting isn't Victor's. The room went silent. Someone else was in that taxi, Marino said gravely. And after 22 years, that someone may finally have to answer for what happened. The morgue was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and lingered no matter how long you stayed. Inside, Maria Alvarez stood at the metal table, her hands trembling as she stared at the body that had once been her husband. For years she had trained herself to imagine him alive somewhere else, maybe in another city, maybe with another family. The cruel gossip in their small San Antonio neighborhood had fed those thoughts until they hardened into belief. But now, looking down at the figure covered in time's damage, yet still familiar in ways only a wife could see, that belief collapsed. She pressed her hands to her face and wept openly. Daniel stood beside her, rigid, gripping the edge of the table as if it was the only thing holding him upright. His jaw clenched so tightly that veins stood out along his temple. For years he had told himself the same lie the town whispered. His father had abandoned them. He had built his life on that anger, every decision fueled by a quiet resentment that he wasn't worth staying for. But now, here was his father, not a runaway, not a deserter, but a man murdered and hidden beneath water for more than 2 decades. The weight of it hollowed Daniel's chest. The medical examiner, Dr. Alicia Perez, explained carefully, her voice quiet and respectful. She pointed to the back of Victor's skull, where the bone bore a small, round fracture. A single bullet, small caliber, fired at close range. The kind of shot meant to kill cleanly without drawing attention. She explained that the oxygen-starved waters of Medina Lake had preserved the body more than anyone would expect. Instead of being consumed by decay, Victor had remained sealed away in a dark pocket where even bacteria struggled to thrive. His seatbelt had held him upright the entire time, a macabre stillness in a drowned cab that no one thought to search. Forensic specialists had recovered his wallet from the inside pocket of his jacket, damp but intact, still holding his driver's license, some faded family photos, and even a few coins. All of it, Dr. Perez said, had been suspended in time like the moment of his death had never passed. Maria listened, but barely absorbed the words. All she saw was the man she married when she was only 19. The father who had once kissed their son on the forehead before every night shift. She reached out a trembling hand and rested it gently against the sheet covering his arm. For years she had told herself he chose to leave. Now, all she could think was that he had been taken from her, from them, and left alone at the bottom of the lake. The sheriff, standing quietly until now, opened the evidence folder he carried. Inside was the water-warped but still legible logbook. It had survived because Victor, like many cab drivers, kept his daily records sealed in a plastic sleeve to protect against spills in the cab. That habit, simple and ordinary, had preserved the single most important piece of evidence in the case. Sheriff Marino flipped carefully to the final page and slid it across the table. The writing was uneven, hurried, but clear enough to read. Maria leaned closer, tears dripping onto the steel surface. Daniel furrowed his brow, his grease-stained hands awkward against the pristine latex gloves the examiner had provided him so he could handle the page. The entry was dated November 17th, 1990, nearly midnight. One final fare was logged, but the handwriting wasn't Victor's. It was rougher, slanted in the way Maria didn't recognize. She had seen her husband's writing thousands of times, his. Neat block letters on grocery lists, the way he signed his name on Daniel's school forms, the little notes he'd leave on the fridge. This wasn't his. Sheriff Marino spoke quietly, letting the weight of the page settle. Your husband didn't record this. Someone else was in that cab. Someone wrote down this last fare in their own hand. Daniel shook his head, struggling to process. So what does that mean? He picked someone up who wrote in his book. Why would they even do that? The sheriff tapped the page. That's the question, isn't it? Someone wanted to leave a record, maybe to stage something. Or maybe Victor refused to do it, so they wrote it themselves. Either way, it means your father wasn't alone that night. The room seemed to shrink around him. Maria closed her eyes, replaying the night of his disappearance. Every moment she had begged for answers. She remembered sitting by the phone, dialing the police, being told that grown men walk away sometimes. She remembered the insurance agent leaning across her kitchen table, saying if there was no body, it was likely he was alive somewhere else. And she remembered the neighbors lowering their voices when she passed by, muttering about debts, or a secret affair, or a man too tired of family life to stay. Now, here was proof against all of it. Victor had been with someone. Someone who knew how to drive a cab into a lake, who knew which roads led there. Someone who had taken him from them and erased him for 22 years. Daniel pressed his palms flat on the steel table and leaned over the logbook. So all those years, I thought he abandoned us. He didn't. His voice cracked, the anger and grief mingling until it became something sharp in his chest. He didn't leave. He was murdered, Maria sobbed quietly, her shoulders trembling. He was trying to come home to us, she whispered. Sheriff. Marino closed the folder carefully. This changes the narrative. For 22 years, this case was cold. Now we have a body, a bullet, and a logbook. That's enough to start asking the right questions again. And there's one man who will have to answer them. Daniel looked up, his eyes still wet but burning with new focus. Who? The sheriff. Hesitated, weighing his words. Victor's dispatcher. Raymond Torres, the man you called Uncle Ray. The name hung in the cold air, familiar and suddenly foreign all at once. The name landed like a stone in the room. Maria blinked as though she hadn't heard it right. Daniel frowned, his jaw set. Uncle Ray? Sheriff Marino nodded gravely. Raymond Torres. He was Victor's dispatcher the night he vanished. And if what we believe is true, he may know far more than he ever told us. Maria shook her head immediately, shaking it so hard her earrings rattled. No, Raymond. He was family to us. After Victor disappeared, he was the one who came by. He helped with the paperwork, with the taxi company, with the insurance. He even brought groceries sometimes when I couldn't make ends meet. He was... Her voice trailed off, faltering. He was there when nobody else was. The sheriff leaned forward. And that's exactly why we need to look at him closely. Because he wasn't just a dispatcher. He was the last man Victor spoke to on the radio. And records show that he told investigators in 1990 he wasn't even on duty that night. Daniel's brow furrowed. But if he wasn't on duty, why was he at the office when my dad radioed in? Marino opened his folder again, pulling out a yellowed report stamped with the date. November 18th, 1990. This is his original statement. He claimed he went home early, wasn't logged into the radio system, and didn't know about Victor's last fare. But the radio log tells a different story. The last transmission Victor made, taking a fare across town, was answered. And it wasn't answered by another driver. It was answered by Raymond Torres. Maria pressed her hand against her mouth. The room seemed to tilt. For 22 years she had held on to Raymond as one of the only people who never judged her. When neighbors whispered that Victor had run, Raymond told her not to listen. When Daniel grew rebellious as a teenager, skipping school and punching walls, Raymond would stop by to talk to him like an uncle would, telling him he needed to stay strong. For his mother. Now, all those visits felt poisoned by a new suspicion. Daniel's voice was sharp, so he lied. Not just once, Marino said. He lied multiple times. We found payroll slips showing he clocked out late that night, after midnight, and his car was spotted near the downtown stand where Victor picked up his last passenger. But in his statement, he claimed he never left home. That alone is enough to reopen the case against him. The sheriff slid another photo across the table. It was of a middle-aged Raymond from 1991, taken during the original investigation. Dark mustache, thinning hair, weary eyes that gave away nothing. Beside it, Marino placed a more recent photo from a driver's license renewal just 5 years ago. Age had thickened his body, but the eyes were the same. Maria couldn't reconcile the two images with the man who had sat in her kitchen, eating caldo de palo and telling her to keep faith. He used to bring Daniel little toy cars, she whispered. He told me Victor probably just got overwhelmed. That men sometimes run, and I believed him. Daniel stared at the photo, his fists clenched. He kept us thinking my dad abandoned us. He let me hate my father all these years. And the whole time, he was lying? Marino nodded. That's what we're beginning to suspect, and there's more. Raymond had financial troubles in 1990. He owed thousands in gambling debts to a man named Arturo Morales, a local bar owner, with ties to organized crime. Morales used taxi drivers to move cash around the city. We think Victor may have found out, and Raymond may have been under pressure to keep him quiet. The pieces clicked together slowly, painfully. Maria remembered one night, only a few weeks before Victor disappeared. He had come home late, tired, with grease on his hands. He kissed her on the forehead and told her not to worry, but she'd noticed a furrow in his brow, the way he stared. Out the window as though waiting for someone to follow him home. She never asked. She wished she had. Daniel sat back, shaking his head. So, what you're saying Uncle Ray was mixed up with mobsters? That he killed my father over debts? Marino's face was grim. That's one theory. We're not ready to make an arrest, but everything we've found so far points in his direction. The lies, the debts, the connections. And the fact that he was the last man to hear Victor's voice. Maria closed her eyes, her tears returning. She remembered Christmas of 1991, their first without Victor. A man had shown up at the door, with presents wrapped in shiny paper, calling himself Sonore to make Daniel smile. He had sat beside her on the couch, telling her to stay strong, that maybe Victor was out there somewhere, trying to build a new life. She had clung to his words. Now, looking back, she felt sick. Those words hadn't been comfort. They had been cover. The sheriff leaned forward. I know this is hard to hear, but if we want to find justice for Victor, we have to confront the possibility that the man you trusted most may have been the one who betrayed him. Daniel's knuckles whitened. Then we confront him. We make him answer for it. Marino shook his head. Not yet. We need more. If we move too fast, he'll deny everything and we'll lose him. But make no mistake, he's our prime suspect now. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Maria looked at the two. Photographs again, side by side. The younger Raymond, who had lied to the police. The older Raymond, who had become part of their lives in Victor's absence. Both faces belonged to the same man. And now both were tainted. For the first time in 22 years, Maria felt the sharp edge of betrayal cut deeper than the grief of loss. Victor hadn't left her, but the man she had leaned on in her darkest moments might have been the one who made sure he never came home. When Victor Alvarez disappeared in 1990, the official search lasted 8 months. Police canvassed routes, dredged ditches, and interviewed passengers who might have seen him that night. But as weeks stretched into months, the town's patience wore thin. San Antonio was no stranger to crime or vanishing acts. People whispered at church and barber shops, at corner stores. They didn't whisper about murder. They whispered about shame. Some said Victor had debts. He liked to play cards, didn't he? A few nights a week, when fares were slow, he'd stop at the back room of a cantina on the west side. Maybe he owed the wrong man too much money and skipped town to avoid paying. Others claimed there was a woman, some secret life no one knew about, a young waitress he'd picked up late at night, maybe. They said he had grown tired of his responsibilities, of Maria working him to death, of raising a son in a small house that barely fit the three of them. A man could get restless, they said. A man could drive away from one life and into another. Maria had lived with those whispers like stones in her shoes. Each step through the grocery store aisle, each trip to Mass on Sundays, she felt them pressing against her. For years, she defended Victor out loud, insisting he would never abandon his family. But in the quiet of her room, when the neighbors' voices wouldn't stop circling in her head, even she wondered. She pictured him walking into a bus station, buying a ticket with cash, vanishing into a city where nobody knew his name. She hated herself for imagining it, but she couldn't stop. Daniel felt the weight of those rumors more cruelly than anyone. At school, classmates repeated what they heard at home. Your dad ran off. He didn't want you. By the time he was 12, Daniel had started fighting, throwing fists at boys who laughed about his father, or worse, pitied him. Teachers tried to help, but the story always returned. Victor Alvarez had chosen freedom over family. Daniel believed it, because believing it was easier than waiting for a father who never came home. Now, 22 years later, those old rumors hung in the room as Sheriff Marino laid out what investigators were finding. We're reviewing all the stories from back then, he told Maria and Daniel, and most of them don't hold water. Victor's financial records showed late payments. Sure, but nothing like the gambling debts people claimed. In fact, the biggest debts belonged to Raymond Torres. He was the one owing money to a local bar owner named Arturo Morales. Morales ran a place called El Camino. You might remember it. Maria did. El Camino was a dim-lit bar near the freight yards, the kind of place cab drivers stopped between shifts for a beer and quick cash games. She remembered Victor coming home one night smelling of stale smoke, saying he'd had to collect a fare there. His expression that night had been troubled, as though the place had shown him something he didn't want to see. Morales had his hand in a lot of things, Marino continued. Gambling, loan sharking, moving money. Taxi drivers made easy couriers, cash in, cash out, no questions asked. Raymond was deeply tied into that world. But when Victor vanished, instead of Morales' name coming up, all anyone could talk about was Victor's supposed debts. It was easier to smear the missing man than to point at the people with real power. Daniel leaned forward, his hands locked together. So those rumors about my dad, they were planted? Maybe not planted, Marino said carefully. But once they started, no one tried to stop them. And Raymond didn't correct them. He benefited from them. As long as people thought Victor had abandoned his family, nobody was looking at him. Maria's chest tightened. She remembered one particular night in 1992, nearly 2 years after Victor disappeared. Raman had stopped by with groceries, milk, beans, even a small toy car for Daniel. They sat at her kitchen table, the yellow light buzzing overhead, and Raymond told her she had to move on. Victor wasn't the man you thought he was. He had said gently, almost sorrowfully. Sometimes men just break. At the time, she had cried into her hands, grateful for his comfort. Now those words felt like daggers. He hadn't been comforting her. He had been covering his tracks. Marino pulled another piece of evidence from his folder, a small matchbook preserved in plastic. Its cover was warped and water-stained, but the name was still legible. El Camino. We recovered this from the taxi's floorboard. We can't prove it belonged to Victor, but combined with Raymond's debts and Morales' influence, it ties the scene back to the criminal world he was. Circling. Daniel stared at the matchbook, his stomach twisting. He had been to El Camino once, years later as a teenager. The place smelled of sweat and desperation. Now, he imagined his father sitting there on that last night, picking up a fare from a man with connections, a man who would lead him to the road by Medina Lake. So all those years, Daniel said slowly, his voice low, we thought my dad ran off. When really, he may have been silenced because he saw something he shouldn't have. The sheriff nodded. That's what we're beginning to believe. Raymond owed money. Morales needed couriers. Victor may have been caught in the middle. And the easiest way to bury the problem was to bury him. The room fell into silence. Maria stared at the matchbook through the evidence bag, her tears drying into hard lines on her face. She thought of the night she sat awake, wondering if her husband was alive somewhere, building another life. Now the truth settled on her shoulders. He had been murdered because he was too honest, too unwilling to bend to the corruption around him. And for 22 years, she had lived in the shadow of lies told to protect the guilty. For Daniel, the realization burned deeper. His father hadn't abandoned him. His father had been taken from him, erased by a man he once called uncle and by criminals who saw him as expendable. The anger he had carried since childhood no longer had a target in his father. It had a target in the shadows that Raymond and Morales cast over their lives. The matchbook from El Camino wasn't just a scrap of paper pulled from the muck of a drowned taxi. To Sheriff Marino and the detectives reopening Victor's case, it was a thread, one that, when pulled, led into the shadows of San Antonio's criminal underbelly. El Camino had been more than just a bar in 1990. By day, it looked like a tired cantina, neon beer signs buzzing faintly in the window, smoke curling above the pool tables. But after dark, its back rooms became something else. High-stakes poker, cash loans, and the kind of deals where men didn't shake hands so much as they exchanged quiet nods and envelopes. It was owned by Arturo Morales, a man whose name had surfaced in police files for 2 decades, but had never stuck to a single charge. Morales knew how to stay out of reach. He let others take the risks while he kept his hands clean. Taxi drivers, it turned out, were some of his most useful couriers. Maria sat rigid as Marino explained it all in his office days after they had viewed Victor's body. She had known Victor sometimes picked up fares near the freight yards. She had even heard him complain once about that damn bar and how he hated waiting there for customers. But she had never understood the layers beneath it. "You're saying they use the taxes?" she asked, her voice brittle. Moreno nodded. Drivers were paid extra to carry cash, gambling payouts, sometimes packages. Nothing that would draw attention. A cab pulls up, a bag goes in, another cab takes it out. To most people, it looked like routine fares. To Morales, it was a laundering system that kept money moving quietly across the city. "And Raymond?" Daniel asked, his voice tight. The sheriff sighed. Raymond was in deep. He owed Morales money from gambling. Big money. Our records show bank withdrawals, short-term loans, pawn slips, all from the months leading up to your father's disappearance. He was cornered. Morales didn't forgive debts. He found ways to make you work them off. Daniel clenched his fists. "So my dad knew. That's why he was killed, isn't it?" Moreno glanced at the logbook again. That last entry could have been written by anyone. But what we do know is that your father wasn't the kind of man to let himself be used that way. If Raymond asked him to move money or sign off on fake records, he would have refused. And if he refused, then he became a problem. And problems don't live long in Morales's world. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She thought back to one night in early November 1990. Victor had come home late, his face pale beneath the porch light. She remembered asking if he was all right. He kissed her cheek, told her he was fine, but the way he lingered at the window that night stayed with her. Now she realized he had seen something or been asked something that weighed on him. Detectives began pulling financial records from the old taxi company. Invoices were inconsistent. Logs from drivers other than Victor had suspicious gaps. Hours unaccounted for. Fares that didn't add up. Raymond had signed off on many of them. In one file, investigators found a note scribbled in the margin. El Camino, cash drop. It was the same slanted handwriting as the final entry in Victor's logbook. Daniel stared at the photocopy. So it was him. Ramon was in that cab. He wrote that line. "And then he killed my dad." "Maybe," Moreno said carefully. "We have to build the case brick by brick. But what's clear is that Raymond was neck deep in Morales's operation. And your father may have been the only man honest enough to say no." The sheriff's words settled like dust in the room. Maria closed her eyes, remembering Victor's stubborn streak, the way he refused to cut corners, even when it cost him time or money. He once returned home with half his earnings because he had refused to overcharge a drunk passenger who offered too much. She had scolded him for it, saying they needed the money, but he had only smiled. "I won't take what isn't mine," he had said. That same stubborn honesty, she realized now, might have cost him his life. Investigators dug deeper into Morales's network. They found that several drivers tied to Raymond had gone missing from records in the early 90s. Not murdered. Not vanished like Victor, but men who suddenly quit, disappeared from the company, left town without explanation. It painted a picture of fear. Drivers who had seen too much and fled before they could be silenced. Victor hadn't fled. He had stayed loyal to his family and his job, and paid the price. Daniel sat in the sheriff's office, staring at the walls covered in maps and notes. His chest burned with anger. For 22 years, we thought he left us. All this time, it was this. Some low-life bar owner and a dispatcher we trusted more than family. Moreno didn't argue. This case was mishandled from the start. Too much gossip, too many assumptions. But now we have more than a body. We have connections. We have a motive. And we have suspects. Maria's eyes flicked to the matchbook in its evidence bag, to the logbook with its alien handwriting, to the photo of Raymond Torres pinned to the board on the wall. The man who had sat in her living room, the man who had told her not to lose hope, now looked back at her from a police file as the prime suspect in her husband's murder. She whispered under her breath, so quietly even Daniel barely heard her. "You lied to me. All these years, you lied." For the Alvarez family, the rumors that had once haunted them, debts, infidelity, abandonment, were beginning to dissolve. In their place, new shadows rose, organized crime, betrayal, and a dispatcher who had traded loyalty for survival. The truth was uglier than the gossip, but it was finally within reach. The sheriff's office had given Maria and Daniel time to breathe after the revelations about Morales and Raymond, but breathing came with its own torment. At home, their small brick house on the edge of San Antonio felt less like a refuge and more like a time capsule that had been sealed in shame for 22 years. Every room held something of Victor's, yet Maria had trained herself not to see it. The smell of old leather in the closet, the dusty shoebox on the top shelf, even the taxi company jacket folded neatly in a box, all of it had been left untouched, because touching it had meant acknowledging the man who left them. Now, with the truth shifting beneath their feet, those relics demanded to be looked at again. One evening, Daniel insisted they go through the old boxes stored in the garage. The air was heavy with heat and dust, the kind of Texas summer air that made breathing a chore. Cardboard had sagged and stained in the corners where rain had leaked years before, but the boxes still stood in uneven stacks, each labeled in Maria's handwriting: winter clothes, kitchen, Victor. That last one she had avoided for decades. Daniel pulled it down and set it on the concrete floor. He opened the flaps carefully, as if the past might spill out and drown them both. Inside were Victor's personal things, a stack of old cab licenses, pay stubs, pocket notebooks, and a few Polaroids of Daniel as a child taped into the corners of a leather wallet. Maria picked up the wallet, pressing it to her chest, tears running silently down her face. Daniel, meanwhile, sifted through the notebooks. Most were ordinary. Notes on fares, small calculations of income and gas expenses, reminders written in Victor's neat block letters. But one, thinner than the rest, caught his attention. It was worn along the edges, as if handled often. Inside, the handwriting shifted. Some pages were quick, almost frantic. The ink darker, the stroke sharper. "Mom," Daniel said quietly, "you need to see this." Maria leaned over as he turned the pages. The entries weren't just numbers. They were observations. Short lines, like a man writing things he wasn't supposed to put on paper but couldn't keep in his head. Raymond short on payouts again. Strange man at El Camino. Raymond covering shift. Morales, cash moving through cabs. Can't be legal. Raymond asked me to sign insurance forms I never filed. Refused. Maria pressed her hand to her mouth. Each note felt like a whisper from the grave, her husband speaking through the pages. He hadn't been blind. He had seen the corruption circling him, had known Raymond was skimming, had recognized Morales' shadow falling over the taxi stand. He had even refused to sign false papers. That refusal, she realized, might have sealed his fate. Daniel flipped further, his hand trembling. At the back of the notebook was a final entry, circled twice. If anything happens, it's Raymond. He owes Morales. Watch El Camino. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The garage was silent, except for the buzz of a lone cicada outside. Maria's chest ached as though her heart had been pierced. Her husband had known he was in danger. He had left a message, a warning, not for police, but for them, for the family who might one day wonder what had happened. Daniel's throat tightened. He tried to protect us, he knew. His voice cracked. And I wasted all these years. Hitting him, Maria touched his arm. "No, Mio. You didn't know. None of us knew. He carried it alone because he didn't want to burden us." She wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "Your father died trying to do the right thing. That's who he was." They brought the notebook to Sheriff Marino the next day. He handled it with gloves, scanning the pages carefully. His expression hardened as he read the last entry. "This changes things. It's not just speculation now. It's a direct accusation." Victor knew Raymond was compromised. He knew Morales was involved. And he left a record, even if no one saw it until now. Daniel's voice was heavy with anger. "So, what are we waiting for?" "Arrest him." Marino shook his head. "It's not that simple. These are notes, not a confession. Defense lawyers will say it's hearsay, speculation, even paranoia. But combined with the logbook and the matchbook, it builds a narrative. What we need now is a witness. Someone alive who can place Raymond where he claimed not to be. Maria clutched the notebook tightly, as though it were Victor's hand itself. He trusted the truth would come out someday, she said softly. We can't let him down now. The sheriff nodded. We won't. I think I know who might finally be ready to talk. The notebook had changed everything, but as Sheriff Marino explained, words on a page, even Victor's words, could only push the case so far. What they needed now was a living witness, someone who could confirm what Victor had suspected all those years ago. And there was one person who had lived in Raymond Torres' shadow long enough to know pieces of the truth. His estranged wife, Elena. Elena Torres lived in a modest apartment on the east side of San Antonio. The marriage had collapsed more than a decade earlier after years of late nights, financial strain, and whispers of infidelity. Raymond had walked out on her the way people claimed Victor had walked out on Maria, only in his case, it was true. For years, Elena had remained silent, keeping what she knew locked away. But when news broke on the local stations about the discovery at Medina Lake, she stared at the television screen for hours. The yellow cab rising out of the water, the body confirmed as Victor Alvarez, the sheriff speaking about reopening the investigation. It all stirred memories she had buried, so deep she almost convinced herself they were dreams. When Marino knocked on her door with Maria and Daniel standing behind him, Elena hesitated. She looked older than her years, her dark hair streaked with gray, her eyes heavy with fatigue. At first, she refused to speak, saying she didn't want to get involved. But Marino pressed gently. If there's anything you remember from that night, anything at all, now is the time. You could be the difference between justice and silence. Elena's gaze lingered on Maria, who stood quietly behind the sheriff, her face lined with grief but steady. Two women who had lived parallel lives, one believing her husband abandoned her, the other knowing hers had been a liar. Slowly, Elena stepped aside and let them in. They sat at her small kitchen table, the same table she had eaten at alone for years. The walls were lined with fading photos of children and grandchildren, her attempts at building a life after Raymond. She poured coffee into chipped mugs, her hand shaking. Finally, she spoke. That night, she began, her voice thin. He came home late, later than usual. It must have been past 2. He smelled of alcohol, of smoke, but there was something else. Mud. His shoes were caked in it. His shirt had a dark stain near the collar. She paused, swallowing hard. I asked him what happened. He said nothing, just that it was a long night, and he went straight to the shower. I washed the shirt the next morning. The stain came out, but I remember thinking it wasn't wine, it wasn't grease. It was darker. He told me never to bring it up again. Maria's chest tightened. She imagined Raymond sitting at her own kitchen table, smiling gently, telling her to have faith. Meanwhile, this same man had come home to Elena with mud on his shoes and blood on his shirt. Elena continued, her hands clasped around the coffee mug. I should have gone to the police. I thought about it, but Raymond could be violent, not with fists, but with words, with threats. He said if I ever crossed him, I'd regret it. And then, when Victor's case went cold, I convinced myself maybe I imagined it. Maybe the stain wasn't what I thought it was. But now, seeing his body on the news, I know what I saw. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low, controlled but trembling. You're saying my dad was already dead when Raymond came home? Elena nodded slowly. Yes, he was different that night. He didn't look at me, didn't speak more than a few words. Like a man carrying a weight he couldn't put down. I know he did something terrible. Marino set down his notepad, his expression firm but respectful. Mrs. Torres, would you be willing to put that in a statement? Elena hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. I'm old now. I don't want trouble, but Victor's family deserves peace. And Raymond deserves what's coming. She straightened in her chair, her resolve hardening. Yes, I'll testify. The room was quiet. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Maria reached across the table, her hand covering Elena's. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea what this means. Elena shook her head. I do. I lived with him too. I know the lies. I know the charm he used to hide behind. But I also know the truth has a way of clawing its way out, no matter how long it takes. When they left Elena's apartment, the air outside felt different. Lighter, though the weight of what they carried was immense. Daniel walked a few steps. Ahead, his fists clenched, his mind racing. For years he had despised his father for abandoning them. Now, standing under the pale glow of a street lamp, he realized the man who deserved his hatred was someone else entirely, the man he had. Once called Uncle Ray, Sheriff Marino looked at him carefully. This is progress. It's not everything, but it's something solid. Elena's statement confirms Raymond came home that night covered in mud and blood. It places him at the scene, or close enough to it. Combined with the notebook and the logbook, we're building a case. Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. Then keep building. I want him to answer for every single day we thought my dad left us. Maria slipped her arm around her son's shoulders, her eyes fixed on the horizon. For the first time in 22 years, the shadows of rumor were giving way to something sharper, clearer. The truth was surfacing, one piece at a time. Elena's testimony had given the case a heartbeat, but Sheriff Marino knew testimony alone wasn't enough. Courts were unforgiving. Defense attorneys could rip apart memories, especially ones buried for 2 decades. What they needed was something stronger, something undeniable. And it turned out Victor Alvarez had left more than just a notebook. Back in 1990, taxi drivers in San Antonio had started carrying small handheld tape recorders. It wasn't required by law, but the company encouraged it, especially for night shifts. They were meant to be insurance, a way to record disputes over fares or in case a driver was attacked. Most drivers use them inconsistently, often forgetting to hit record in the blur of long nights. But Victor was meticulous. He'd always carried one, slipping it into the glove compartment before each shift. When divers pulled his cab from Medina Lake, the recorder had been among the debris. At first it was overlooked, waterlogged, and caked in silt. But forensic technicians tried it carefully, dismantled it piece by piece, and managed to recover the magnetic tape sealed inside. The sound was warped, muffled, but still there. And what it contained would remove every trace of doubt about what happened that night. Marino called Maria and Daniel into the sheriff's office on a quiet morning. The blinds were drawn, the air tense with expectation. On the table sat a small player, the kind that looked outdated even in 2012. An evidence tag hung from its cord. Marino sat across from them, his face lined with gravity. What you're about to hear isn't easy, he said. But it's important. This is the recording we recovered from Victor's cab. Parts of it are damaged, but the most critical moments survived. I need you to prepare yourselves. Maria gripped Daniel's hand tightly, her knuckles white. For years she had longed to hear Victor's voice again, and now the chance came wrapped in dread. Marino pressed play. At first there was only static, the hiss of water damage. Then, faint but clear, Victor's voice emerged. Calm, tired, the way he sounded after long shifts. November 17th, 1990. Shift log, 11:30 p.m., heading downtown stand. Maria covered her mouth. Tears slid down her cheeks. Daniel's chest heaved as though the air had been knocked out of him. The tape clicked, silence, then another voice. A man's rougher, familiar, Raymond Torres. Come on, Victor. Just sign the damn papers. It's nothing. Everyone does it. Victor's reply came, steady, resolute. I'm not signing anything. You know this isn't legal. You're using the cabs to move money. You think I don't see it? There was a scraping sound, a shuffle, as if someone was leaning across the seat. Raymond's voice grew sharper. You don't understand. I don't have a choice. Morales wants this. If you don't play along, you're not just hurting yourself. You're putting me in the ground. Victor's reply was firmer now, his voice rising with frustration. Then take your own fall, Raymond. Don't drag me into it. I have a family. I won't do it. The room was silent except for the faint whir of the tape. Then came a sound that froze Maria and Daniel in place, the metallic click of a gun being cocked. Raymond's voice again, lower, threatening. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Victor's voice, calm but defiant. "If you pull that trigger, you'll have to live with it. But I'll never be part of this." Then, a single muffled pop. The unmistakable crack of a .22 caliber round. The recorder rattled, a door slamming, dragging sounds, the creak of a seatbelt. And finally, the hollow splash of water. The tape ended in static. Maria's sobs filled the sheriff's office. She leaned into Daniel, her body shaking. Daniel pressed his fist to his forehead, tears streaming down his face. It wasn't just proof. It was his father's last words, his refusal to bend, his choice to face death rather than betray his principles. Marino turned off the player, his eyes heavy. "This is it. This is the evidence we needed. We have Raymond's voice, your father's refusal, the gunshot, the cover-up. It's the smoking gun." Daniel's voice cracked, his grief mixing with rage. "He killed him. He killed my father and then sat in our house for years pretending to be family. I'll never forgive him." Maria clutched the table, whispering through her tears. "Victor, he was loyal. He never abandoned us. Even at the end, he chose to stand for what was right." Marino nodded solemnly. "The world needs to hear this. A jury needs to hear this." Raymond thought Medina Lake would keep his secret. But Victor's voice survived him. The weight of the recording hung in the room like a final testament. Victor Alvarez had been silenced in life, but in death, he had spoken louder than ever. His refusal, his integrity, his murder, all captured. In a few haunting minutes of tape that had waited 22 years beneath the water. For Maria, the recording was agony, but also liberation. It shattered the lie she had lived under for half her life. For Daniel, it was a revelation that replaced anger at a father he thought abandoned him with rage at the man who had stolen him away. And for the investigators, it was the cornerstone of a case that could finally bring justice. The recording changed everything. It wasn't just evidence. It was a doorway, one that opened into a much larger world than Maria or Daniel had ever imagined. Raymond Torres had pulled the trigger, but he hadn't been acting in a vacuum. He had been a desperate man, crushed between debt and fear. And the name on his lips that night, the shadow looming behind him, was Arturo Morales. Within days of the tape's discovery, the case shifted from a county investigation to something far bigger. Sheriff Marino handed copies of the tape and Victor's notebooks to federal authorities. The FBI had been circling Morales for years, but like smoke in the wind, he always slipped through their fingers. They had suspicions of racketeering, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and money laundering, but never a direct tie. Now for the study. First time, they had a murder, a clean, documented link between Morales' operation and the body. Maria sat in her living room when agents first knocked on her door. She remembered the sound of their shoes on the wooden floor, the way their suits seemed out of place in her modest home. They explained carefully, in calm tones, that the investigation was no longer just about her husband's murder. It was about dismantling a network that had operated in San Antonio's shadows for decades. Your husband, one agent said gently, stood up against something much bigger than he knew. And for that, he lost his life. Now we're going to make sure. His sacrifice means something. Daniel listened from the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Part of him was numb. For weeks now he had been pulled from one revelation to the next, his world rewritten each time. First his father hadn't abandoned them. Then he had been murdered. Then the murderer had been a man he once trusted. And now, that betrayal was only the tip of a much deeper iceberg. The agents explained what they knew. Morales' network had started small in the late 1980s. Poker games at El Camino. Small loans to desperate men. Payouts ferried quietly across town. But it grew. Taxi companies became the perfect front. Cabs could move cash across the city without attracting attention. Drivers could be paid to look the other way. Raymond, as dispatcher, controlled the flow. He knew which cars went where, which drivers could be trusted, and who owed too much to say no. Morales rewarded loyalty with small envelopes of cash and punished disobedience with threats that rarely stayed threats for long. Victor's refusal had been a disruption. A man who wouldn't sign false papers, who wouldn't carry money, who wouldn't bend. Raymond had begged him, but Morales had demanded results. And when Victor refused, Raymond had made his choice. For Maria, hearing it laid out like that was like watching her life turn inside out. She thought of all the years she had blamed herself. Wondered if she had driven Victor away with her expectations, her questions. Now the truth was clear. It wasn't her. It wasn't debts. It wasn't another woman. It was power, greed, corruption that had swallowed her husband whole. The FBI began connecting dots. Other drivers had gone missing from records in those years. Not dead, not vanished like Victor, but men who quietly left the company and disappeared from San Antonio. One name surfaced repeatedly: Luis Herrera, a driver who had fled to Mexico in 1991. Agents tracked him down, now living in Monterrey, gray-haired and weary. Herrera admitted he had run because he saw Morales' men using taxis to move bags he suspected were filled with cash or drugs. "We all knew Raymond was in over his head," Herrera said. "But when Victor refused, we knew he was marked. I left before they could mark me too." That testimony, paired with Elena's statement and the tape, painted a picture too vivid to ignore. The FBI obtained warrants. They raided El Camino, seizing financial ledgers, poker chips, and hidden cash. Morales himself was careful. He wasn't there the night of Victor's murder, and he hadn't written in the ledgers. But his fingerprints were everywhere in the structure. Raymond had been his pawn, and Victor his casualty. For Daniel, watching the news coverage of those raids was surreal. Anchors spoke of Morales as a crime boss, of taxi companies as criminal pipelines. But for Daniel, it wasn't headlines. It was his father's life, reduced to sound bites. He sat in the dark of his apartment, staring at the television, feeling both vindicated and hollow. His father had been right. He had stood against something corrupt, and he had paid with his life. One night, Daniel drove out to Medina Lake. The construction crews were long gone, the water lower than it had been in decades. He parked near the spot where the taxi had been pulled from the depths. The shoreline was quiet, only the ripple of water breaking the silence. He stood there for a long time, imagining his father's last moments. The argument in the cab, the gunshot, the darkness, closing in. But he also imagined his father's voice, steady, refusing to give in. "I won't do it. I have a family. I won't." Those words, preserved on the tape, now echoed across the lake like a defiant vow. Back in San Antonio, Raymond Torres was in custody. He had been arrested quietly, without spectacle, pulled from his small home where he had lived comfortably all those years. When confronted with the tape, he went pale. He muttered excuses, claimed it wasn't his voice, that the recorder was faulty, that the FBI had spliced it together. But even he seemed to know the walls were closing in. Morales' empire was unraveling, and he was the thread that had been pulled loose. For Maria, the widening investigation was both justice and torment. It confirmed everything Victor had died for, but it also dragged her deeper into a world she had never wanted to know. Each new headline, each new revelation, was another reminder of how far the corruption had spread and how small Victor must have felt standing against it. Yet, she also knew, deep down, that her husband's stand had mattered. Without him, without that tape, Morales would still be untouchable. The wider net had been cast, and for the first time in 22 years, justice didn't feel like a dream. It felt possible. Raymond Torres had always been Uncle Ray in Daniel's memory. The man who brought toy cars to Christmas, who sat at their kitchen table with easy smiles and soft words, who told Maria not to lose hope. But now, when Daniel saw him sitting behind a glass partition at the county detention center, he was no uncle, no family, no friend. He was a murderer. Maria and Daniel were escorted into the visitors' area, the walls humming with fluorescent light, the air heavy with disinfectant. In front of them, Raymond sat handcuffed, his orange jumpsuit stark against his sallow skin. His once thick hair was gray now, his mustache trimmed thin. Age had softened his frame, but not his eyes. They were the same eyes that had looked across Maria's table and lied. The same eyes that had watched Daniel grow without his father and said nothing. Daniel lowered himself into the chair, his fist tight on the table. Maria sat beside him, her breathing shallow, her face pale but set. Neither spoke at first. It was Raymond who broke the silence, his voice rough but familiar. "Maria," he said softly, almost pleading. "Danny, I never wanted you to be here." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Don't call me that. You don't get to call me that." Raymond swallowed, shifting in his chair. "I know how this looks. I know what you've heard. But you have to understand, it wasn't supposed to happen like that." Maria's eyes burned with tears. "You sat in my house. You watched me grieve. You watched my son hate his father. And all that time, you knew." Raymond lowered his gaze. "I was trapped. Morales had me cornered. I owed him more money than I could ever pay. If I didn't do what he wanted." Daniel slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "So you killed him, my father, the man who trusted you?" His voice cracked, fury and grief spilling out at once. "You could have gone to the police. You could have run. Instead, you put a gun to his head and then sat with us for 20 years pretending to be family." Raymond's lips trembled. For the first time, the mask of calm slipped, revealing a man consumed by guilt. "You think I don't see his face every night? You think I don't hear his voice, telling me no, telling me he had a family? I didn't want to do it, Danny. God knows I didn't, but Morales gave the order. And if I refused, it would have been me in that lake." Maria shook her head slowly, her tears streaking down her cheeks. "You made a choice, Raymond. Victor made his choice too. He chose his family. He chose to stand against it. You chose yourself." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the hum of the lights. Raymond looked at Daniel, his eyes wet, his voice breaking. "I loved you like a son." Daniel's chest heaved, rage coursing through him. "Then why did you steal my father from me?" Raymond's eyes closed, his shoulders sagging. "Because I was weak. Because I was a coward." Maria's hands shook as she leaned forward, her voice trembling but sharp. "You let me believe my husband abandoned me. You let my boy grow up thinking his father walked away. Every holiday, every birthday, you sat with us and kept that lie alive. You stole 22 years from us. That's more than murder, Raymond. That's betrayal." Raymond's tears spilled freely now, streaking his weathered face. "I know. I know. And I will burn for it. But believe me when I say I never wanted to hurt you. Morales, he owned me. He owned everything." Daniel's eyes burned, his fist still clenched on the table. "You don't get to put this on Morales. You pulled the trigger. You drove the cab into the lake. And then you walked into our home. Like nothing happened. That's on you." The guard tapped the glass, signaling time was up. Maria stood, her body trembling but her voice steady. "Victor deserved better. We deserve better. And you will answer for what you did." Daniel lingered a moment longer, his eyes locked on Raymond's. "You didn't just kill my father," he said, his voice low and hard. "You killed every memory I could have had with him. Every baseball game. Every birthday. Every day he should have been there. That's what you took from me. And I hope you rot thinking about it." As they walked out of the detention center, Maria held Daniel's arm, her own tears falling silently. The confrontation hadn't given them peace, not yet, but it had given them clarity. Raymond was no longer the man who had once been Uncle Ray. He was the man who had betrayed Victor, the man who had betrayed them all. Behind them, Raymond sat slumped in his chair, his hands shaking in the cuffs. For 22 years, he had carried his secret like a stone around his neck. Now, exposed and cornered, he finally felt the full weight of what he had done. And for the first time, he realized it would crush him. The courthouse in downtown San Antonio had seen its share of trials, but none like this. For more than 2 decades, the disappearance of Victor Alvarez had been a cold memory, a whispered rumor. Now it was a headline. Reporters crowded the steps outside the courthouse, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward as though the trial of Raymond Torres wasn't just about one man's murder, but about a community finally confronting its ghosts. Maria Alvarez walked up those steps with Daniel at her side. her black dress neat but simple, her face pale with determination. The years had carved lines into her cheeks, but her eyes were steady. For too long she had been forced to live with lies, to endure gossip about her husband's supposed betrayal. Now she would sit in the courtroom and watch the truth unfold. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation. The jury sat in the box, 12 men and women who would decide whether Raymond would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Across from them, Raymond sat at the defense table in a gray suit, his hair neatly combed, his face carefully blank. He looked smaller than Daniel remembered, diminished somehow, without the warmth of familiarity to cloak him. He glanced once toward Maria and Daniel, but they did not return his gaze. The prosecution began with a simple statement. This case is about loyalty. One man's loyalty to his family and his principles, and another man's betrayal of that. Trust. They laid out the timeline. Victor's disappearance in 1990, the rumors of abandonment, the discovery in 2012 of his cab submerged in Medina Lake, and the bullet wound that wasn't an accident. Then came the evidence. First, the logbook sealed in its plastic folder, presented carefully to the jury. The prosecution pointed to the final entry, scrawled in handwriting that clearly didn't match Victor's. Expert witnesses confirmed the mismatch and compared it to Raymond's own handwriting samples. The connection was clear. Next, Victor's personal notebook, recovered from the Alvarez garage. Pages of observations, short notes that painted a picture of a man who knew something was wrong. The final entry circled twice. If anything happens, it's Raymond. He owes. Morales, watch El Camino. Maria wept quietly in her seat as the words were read aloud. Her husband's voice carried through his handwriting across the years. Then, Elena Torres took the stand. The courtroom hushed as she recounted the night Raymond came home, his shoes muddy, his shirt stained. She described how he avoided her eyes, how he ordered her never to speak of it again. The defense attorney tried to chip away at her credibility, pointing out the years that had passed, the bitterness of a broken marriage. But Elena held firm. I know what I saw, she said, her voice steady, and I know what it meant. The final piece of evidence silenced the room. The tape recorder. The prosecution played it in full, the static, Victor's calm voice logging his shift, then the rising tension between him and Raymond. The jury leaned forward as Victor refused to sign the false papers, as Raymond begged and threatened, as the click of a gun echoed, and then the shot, the dragging, the splash. Maria clutched Daniel's hand, her tears flowing freely, while jurors wiped their own eyes. The courtroom wasn't just hearing evidence. They were hearing a man's last moments, preserved against time itself. The defense tried to argue the tape was inconclusive. They suggested it could have been tampered with, that the voices weren't clear, that static blurred the lines. They called their own audio expert to suggest the possibility of distortion, but the jury had already heard what they needed. The words were too distinct, too damning. As the trial stretched over days, the scope widened. Prosecutors brought in FBI agents to explain Morales' operation, the gambling, the money laundering, the use of taxi drivers as couriers. Financial ledgers seized from El Camino were displayed in court, showing payouts, initials, and coded notes. Morales' name appeared again and again, tied to Raymond through debts and payments. The defense tried to paint Raymond as a victim, a man cornered by Morales, too afraid to say no. They argued he hadn't wanted to kill Victor, that it had been a desperate act of survival. The desperation wasn't a defense against murder. Daniel watched from the gallery, his jaw tight, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He had imagined this moment for years without knowing it, facing the man who had stolen his father. Each witness, each piece of evidence, chipped away at the rage he had carried. His father had never left him. His father had been loyal to the end. It was Raymond who had been weak. Maria sat beside him, her heart heavy but resolute. She remembered the night she had prayed for closure, the years she had lived with shame that wasn't hers to carry. Now, as the truth spilled into the open, she felt both vindicated and broken. She had longed for this moment, yet it was agony to relive it in such detail. Finally, after weeks of testimony, The closing arguments were made. The prosecutor stood before the jury and said simply, Victor Alvarez kept his integrity. He paid for it with his life. Raymond Torres betrayed his friend, his company, and his family. He lied for 22 years. But the truth has a way of surfacing. Just like that cab at the bottom of Medina Lake, the truth rose. And now it's in your hands. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they filed back into the courtroom, the silence was suffocating. Maria held Daniel's hand so tightly her fingers went numb. On the charge of first-degree murder, the foreman read, "We find the defendant, Raymond Torres, guilty." Maria gasped, her tears breaking free again. Daniel exhaled sharply, a sound that was part relief, part rage, part exhaustion. Across the room, Raymond slumped in his chair, his eyes closing as the words echoed around him. The mask was gone. The man who had lied to them, who had sat at their table, who had stolen Victor's life, was finally branded for what he was, a murderer. The judge sentenced Raymond to life in prison without parole. The courtroom stirred, reporters scribbling notes, cameras flashing. But for Maria and Daniel, it wasn't about headlines. It was about the 22 years stolen from them, and the sliver of justice finally returned. Yet the story didn't end there. As Raymond was led away, prosecutors announced further charges against Arturo Morales. The evidence seized at El Camino, combined with Raymond's conviction, would form the backbone of a federal case. Morales had evaded justice for decades, but Victor's murder had dragged him into the light. Maria and Daniel walked out of the courthouse into the bright Texas sun. The air smelled different, fresher somehow. For the first time in decades, the whispers of abandonment were gone. The truth was written in court records, in headlines, in history. Victor Alvarez hadn't run. He hadn't abandoned his family. He had been loyal to the end, and his death had brought down an empire. The trial was over, the verdict given, the cameras gone. For weeks, the Alvarez family's name had been in headlines, their pain displayed on the evening news. But when the courthouse doors closed and the journalists moved on, Maria and Daniel were left with something quieter, heavier, the aftermath. For Maria, justice was bittersweet. She had spent half her life believing her husband had abandoned her. Each holiday, each birthday, each moment Daniel asked why, she had shouldered the weight of a lie she didn't know was a lie. Now, with the truth revealed, she felt both liberated and hollow. She would sit at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and think about the nights Victor used to walk through the door after a long shift, the smell of leather and gasoline clinging to him. She thought about his laugh, the way he hummed old Spanish songs under his breath while fixing things around the house. For so many years she had buried those memories, convinced he had chosen someone else, somewhere else. Now they came back with painful clarity. He hadn't left her. He had been stolen. Daniel carried his own storm. At 30, he had lived most of his life in the shadow of anger, shaping his identity around the belief that his father had abandoned him. That anger had fueled his decisions, his distance from his mother, his mistrust of others. Now, knowing the truth, he felt a grief deeper than any he had known. He walked through his days haunted, not just by the years lost, but by the way he had misjudged the man who had given him life. He would lie awake at night, hearing his father's voice on that tape recorder, steady and defiant. "I have a family. I won't do it." Those words echoed like a vow, and Daniel realized with guilt that he had spent years dishonoring that vow by believing the worst. 1 week after the trial, Sheriff Moreno invited them to the police impound lot. Victor's cab had been drained, towed, and stored there, its metal rusted, its paint dulled by years underwater. When Maria and Daniel arrived, the sun was bright overhead, glaring off the twisted chrome. The cab looked less like a vehicle and more like a relic, a tomb that had held its secrets too long. Maria approached slowly, her hand brushing the side of the car. She remembered riding in that cab once, years ago, when Victor had picked her up after a shift at the diner. She remembered laughing, teasing him about the cracked radio, about how he always kept peppermints in the glove compartment for passengers. Now she traced her fingers over the door handle, imagining him behind the wheel that final night, weary but steady, unaware of the betrayal waiting beside him. Daniel opened the driver's side door, the hinges groaning. Inside, the seats were water-stained, the dashboard cracked. But taped to the dash, barely clinging after years in the dark, was a faded photograph. He pulled it free gently, the edges crumbling in his hands. It was a picture of him, no older than 6, grinning with 2 missing teeth, his arm around a toy fire truck. Victor had carried it with him every night. Even on the night he died, even as he argued with Raymond, even as he refused to sign the papers, he had kept his son's face in front of him. Daniel's throat tightened. He showed the photo to his mother, tears spilling down his face. All these years, I thought he left me, but he had me with him right there, to the very end. Maria pressed the photo to her lips, her sobs quiet, but unrestrained. For the first time, grief and love mingled in her chest without shame. Victor hadn't abandoned them. He had carried them, literally, until his last breath. As they left the impound lot, Daniel felt something shift inside him. For years, his life had been defined by resentment. Now, though the pain remained, he felt the stirrings of something different: responsibility. His father had stood for what was right, even when it cost him everything. That legacy, Daniel realized, was his to carry forward. Back at home, Maria placed the faded photograph on the mantel, beside Victor's wedding picture. For years, she had hidden his images in drawers, unable to look at them without bitterness. Now she displayed them proudly. This was her husband, the man who refused to bend, the man who stayed loyal to his family even in the face of death. His story was no longer one of abandonment. It was one of sacrifice, of integrity, of truth. For Daniel, the reflection was sharper, more restless. He began keeping his father's notebook close, reading the scribbled lines late at night. Each entry felt like a lesson, a warning, a reminder that silence in the face of corruption only let it grow. He didn't yet know what to do with that lesson, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. His father had written it for him. The trial had given them justice. The impound lot had given them proof. But it was the quiet moments afterward, the photo, the notebook, the memory of Victor's voice, that gave them something deeper, a legacy. The weeks after the trial were a strange, quiet blur. For 22 years, Maria and Daniel had lived under the shadow of absence, the unanswered questions, the whispers, the shame. Then, for months, their lives had been consumed by discovery. Investigation, trial. Now that the verdict was handed down and the cameras gone, the silence returned. But it was not the same silence as before. It was not a silence of lies, but one of truth. Maria noticed it first in the mornings. She would stand at the kitchen window, her cup of coffee warm in her hand, and realized that for the first time in decades, she could breathe without wondering if she had been abandoned. Her husband had not walked away. He had been stolen. That truth hurt, but it also lifted a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying. She began to reclaim small things she had lost. She pulled Victor's jacket out of the box in the garage and hung it in the closet. She placed his photograph on the mantel where visitors could see it, daring the world to whisper again. She even cooked his favorite dishes, caldo de res, enchiladas rojas, not as rituals of grief, but as acts of love, reminders that he was still part of their family story. For Daniel, moving forward was harder. He had lived almost his entire life believing a lie, shaping himself around anger at a man who hadn't deserved it. He felt as though he had to rebuild who he was from the ground up. At night, he would sit with his father's notebook in his lap, reading the scribbled warnings about Raymond and Morales. He saw now that Victor had been a man of quiet courage, not the coward he had imagined. Carrying that knowledge was both inspiring and crushing. It made Daniel wonder what kind of man he himself wanted to become. One evening, he drove out to the old baseball field where he used to play as a boy. The chain-link fences were rusted, the bleachers empty. He sat on the bench, staring at the diamond, and remembered how his father had once promised to teach him to pitch. That lesson had never come. For years, Daniel had told himself it was because his father hadn't cared enough to stay. Now he realized the truth. His father had never been given the chance. The grief that welled up inside him wasn't anger anymore. It was mourning for all the stolen moments, the games, the birthdays, the conversations that Raymond's betrayal had erased. But slowly, Daniel began to find new footing. He spent more time with his mother, helping her repair the house, repaint the walls, plant flowers in the yard. They spoke more openly than they ever had before, about Victor, about their pain, about the years lost. For the first time, they weren't bound by silence or lies. They were bound by truth, however painful. The community, too, began to shift. Neighbors who had once whispered rumors now stopped Maria in the street to apologize. Some brought flowers, some only words, but all acknowledged the wrong they had done in judging her. Maria accepted their apologies with quiet grace. She had spent too many years caring about gossip. Now she had the truth, and that was enough. At church, the priest spoke of Victor as a man of loyalty, of sacrifice. He reminded the congregation that gossip could destroy the living as surely as violence. Maria wept softly in the pews, Daniel beside her, their heads bowed. For the first time in years, she felt not judged, but embraced. One afternoon, Daniel visited the sheriff's office. Marino greeted him warmly, offering a firm handshake. "Your father was a brave man," the sheriff said. He stood up to something most men would have bowed to. That kind of courage doesn't vanish. It lives on. Daniel carried those words with him. He wasn't sure yet how to honor them, but he knew he couldn't go back to being the man who lived in resentment. He had to build something better. For Maria, moving forward meant accepting both the truth and the scars. She still woke up some nights with tears on her pillow, still dreaming of Victor walking through the door. But now the dreams were not haunted by betrayal. They were touched with love, with pride. She would whisper his name in the quiet hours, not in anger, but in remembrance. Life did not return to normal because normal had been stolen, but it moved forward, slowly, painfully, beautifully. Maria found herself laughing again, not often, but sometimes, at Daniel's jokes, at memories of Victor's stubborn habits, at the small joys of living. Daniel found himself planning, thinking about the future not as something broken, but as something he could shape. The truth had come at a terrible cost, but it had given them a gift they hadn't expected, the ability to move forward without shame. Victor Alvarez's legacy was no longer abandoned. It was loyalty, love, and courage. And for Maria and Daniel, that was the foundation of a future they could finally begin to build. For 22 years, the story of Victor Alvarez had been told in whispers and half-truths. A taxi driver who had abandoned his wife and child. A man who drove away from responsibility. A ghost who left shame in his place. But now, that story was gone. In its place was the truth. Painful, tragic, but undeniable. Victor had not walked away. He had stood firm. And for that, he had paid with his life. Maria carried that truth with her every day. In the mornings, she would stand at the mantel, where she had placed Victor's photograph beside the faded snapshot Daniel had found in the cab. She would touch the frame gently, whispering his name, no longer in bitterness, but in pride. For so long she had hidden his face, ashamed of what people thought. Now she displayed it openly, daring anyone to suggest he had been a coward. She knew better. He had been a man of courage, one who had refused to bend when bending would have meant betraying himself and his family. Daniel carried it differently. He was young when his father vanished, old enough to feel the absence, too young to understand. He had grown up hard, defensive, carrying anger like a shield. Now, as a man in his 30s, he was finally beginning to lay that shield down. The photograph from the cab, his 6-year-old self, gap-toothed and smiling, had changed. His father had carried that image on every shift, kept it taped to the dashboard like a reminder of why he worked, why he refused to sign Raymond's papers, why he said, "I have a family, I won't." Those words haunted Daniel, but they also shaped him. He no longer saw himself as the boy who had been abandoned. He saw himself as the son of a man who chose loyalty, even when it cost everything. In time, Daniel found himself dreaming of building his own family. He thought about what kind of father he wanted to be, about how he could give his children the moments that had been stolen from him. The anger didn't vanish, Grief never does, but it no longer defined him. In its place was a sense of responsibility, of legacy. For Maria, healing was slower. Nights were still hard. She still woke sometimes reaching for the other side of the bed, forgetting it had been empty for more than 2 decades. But now, when she woke with tears on her face, she could remind herself that Victor hadn't chosen to leave. He had chosen her. He had chosen Daniel. He had chosen honesty. That thought, though it didn't erase the pain, made it bearable. The community, too, remembered differently. Where once there had been gossip, now there was respect. At church, when the priest spoke Victor's name, people bowed their heads. Neighbors who had once whispered apologies now spoke openly of his sacrifice. Victor had become more than the man who vanished. He had become a reminder of what it meant to stay true, even when the cost was unbearable. At Medina Lake, the waters rose again, covering the spot where Victor's cab had rested for so long. From the surface, there was no sign of what had been hidden below. But for Maria and Daniel, the lake would never look the same. Every ripple, every glint of sunlight on its surface was a reminder of the secrets it had held and the truth it had finally released. Sometimes, Daniel drove out there alone, parking near the shoreline and listening to the wind move across the water. He would close his eyes and hear his father's voice on that tape recorder, steady, resolute, unshaken. "I have a family. I won't do it." Those words became more than his father's last stand. They became his father's legacy, a sentence that lived on in him. Victor Alvarez's story did not end in the lake or in the courtroom or even in the headlines that followed. It lived on in the son who now understood the weight of loyalty. It lived on in the wife who could finally speak her husband's name without shame. And it lived on in the truth that surfaced after 2 decades of lies, that a good man had stood his ground. And though it cost him his life, it gave his family something greater than rumor or gossip. It gave them the truth. In the end, Victor Alvarez never abandoned his family. He never ran. He never quit. He was loyal until his last breath. A man whose courage lay hidden beneath the water for 22 years before rising back into the light. And for Maria and Daniel, that truth, though born of pain, was the beginning of something new. A life no longer defined by whispers, but by the memory of a man who chose to stand, and in doing so, gave them a legacy that would never drown.